Okay, so today we'll look at tissues. So there are 4 basic tissues in the human body, namely epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscular tissue, and nervous tissue. So these tissues make up organs in the body. So various organs in the body are made up of a combination of all these 4 basic tissues. So today we'll focus on the first one, which is epithelial tissue. So there are 2 types of epithelial tissue. There's what we call covering epithelial tissue and granular epithelial tissue. Today we'll focus on covering epithelial tissue. Why do we call it covering epithelial tissue? This is a type of tissue that forms internal and external coverings. So the skin or the human body is entirely covered in epithelial tissue. Then all hollow organs and tubes inside the body are lined by epithelial tissue. So covering and lining are used interchangeably. Covering, we're talking about the external surface. Lining, we're talking about internal surface. So what are some of the properties of epithelial tissue? So number 1 is that epithelial tissue is composed of cells that are closely attached to one another. Number 2, cells are polyhedral, meaning the cells have different shapes. Poly means multiple, hydro means shape. So these cells of different shapes are held together by cellular junctions. So cells of epithelial tissue are firmly and tightly held together to give us a sheet-like structure, more like a blanket if you want, which is able to cover internal as well as internal hollow organs, as well as the external surface of the body. Apart from that, the other property of connective epithelial tissue is all cells of epithelial tissue are supported by a basement membrane, meaning all cells will be resting on a basement membrane. You see this dark layer here. That dark layer is basement membrane. Then these are cells. This is one cell, another cell, another cell. And you see that these cells are held together by intercellular junctions. That is another property. Then the other property is that these cells of epithelial tissue are said to be polarized. Cells of epithelial tissue are polarized, meaning the cells who have a basal surface or basal pore, they also have an apical pore. Basal pore and apical pore. What do we mean by that? What we mean by that is that these cells of epithelial tissue will have 2 surfaces. A surface that is sitting on the basement membrane here, and the surface that is above here, which is the apical. So apical is above, basal surface is below. And that way we call these cells as being polarized. Another important feature to mention is that epithelial tissue is not vascularized. Therefore, it is avascular. You don't find blood vessels in this tissue. So there's a barrier between the cells and the connective tissue, which has blood vessel. That barrier is known as the basement membrane. This basement membrane is found in all epithelial tissue, and that's where the cells are seated. Then below it, immediately below it, is connective tissue, which we call lamina propria here. And this connective tissue has blood vessels. So blood vessels do not penetrate through the basement membrane. They remain in connective tissue. And therefore, these cells will only receive their nutrients and gases by the process of diffusion, where gases and nutrients leave these capillaries or blood vessels, diffuse through the connective tissue, diffuse through the basement membrane, and enter the cells. Then these cells will excrete the waste products of metabolism through the basement membrane, through the lamina propria or the connective tissue into the blood vessels. Therefore, the basement membrane not only supports the cells of epithelial tissue, but also acts as a medium of exchange between the blood vessels in connective tissue and the cells of epithelial tissue. That said, we also see that in epithelial tissue, these cells are held together. Here, I mentioned that already, that these cells are connected by intercellular junctions, and therefore these cells form a sheet. You can see this is more like a flattened sheet. And this way, epithelial tissue is able to cover our external surface as well as internal organs, which are hollow, like tubes, the bladder, ureters, urethra, blood vessels, lungs, heart, all those. Now, we said the cells of epithelial tissue are polyhedral, meaning they have different types of shapes. So we'll see that depending on the shape of the cells found in epithelial tissue, we're going to give name to epithelial tissue. So epithelial tissue may have cells that are tall, we call them columnar cells. Epithelial tissue may have cells that are more like a cube, equal sides. So we call them cuboidal cells. Then epithelial tissue can have flat cells, more like scales. So those are known as squamous cells, like we can see here, more like scales of the fish. Hence the name squamous cells. What about function? What are the major functions of epithelial tissue? So epithelial tissue performs the following functions in the body: covering and lining and protecting surfaces. For example, the epidermis of the skin protects the internal environment of the body from the external environment, which is usually contaminated with a lot of various microorganisms that can cause harm to internal tissues. Next is absorption. For example, the intestines. When we eat food, we expect that the intestines will absorb useful molecules into blood. And we said all tubes, like the intestines in the body, are lined by epithelial tissue. Next is secretion. All glands in the body, whether they are endocrine, paracrine, or exocrine glands, are formed by epithelial cells. So that's why epithelial tissue performs secretion. Next is sensation. Our ability to feel or to interpret certain special stimuli. For example, the stimuli of taste. You can taste whether the food is sour, bitter, salt, or sweet. You can also taste the odor of the air that we inspire. For example, you can know that this smell I'm getting is pleasant, or this smell I'm getting is unpleasant, foul smell, and nice smell. For example, perfumes. Perfumes are pleasant. But for example, decaying matter, the smell is unpleasant. All that is because of epithelial tissue found in the nose. When it comes to taste, it's because of epithelial tissue found on our tongue. If you touch your skin, you feel that you are touching your skin. So stimulus of touch, pressure, pain, temperature, the skin is able to do that, even pain itself. Next is contractility. So there are certain cells within the epithelial tissue which we call myoepithelial cells. Myo means muscle. So these cells have dual property. They have property of muscle, at the same time property of epithelial cells. So they will cover external and internal surface, at the same time have the ability to contract and relax. And these cells are usually found around glands. So when they contract, they help the glands to release what they produce. Okay. So because of that, epithelial tissue will cover external and internal surfaces. Therefore, nothing will enter or leave the body without crossing through epithelial cells. So let's begin with classification. How do we classify epithelial tissue? So epithelial tissue can be classified based on 3 systems. System number 1 is number of layers. Number of layers of cells. Okay. System number 2 is shape of cells. Shape of cells. System number 3 is surface specialization or apical specialization. So let's begin with the first one. So we see that when we talk about number of layers, epithelial tissue can be classified into 2 broad categories. So we have what we call simple epithelium. We also have what we call stratified epithelium. Simple epithelium is epithelium which has a single layer of cells, like what we saw earlier on here. 1 cell, 1 cell, 1 cell, 1 cell. There are no cells sitting on top of each other. So we call such epithelium as unilaminar epithelium or simple epithelium. Then we also have epithelium where cells are sitting on top of one another. We call such epithelium as multilaminar epithelium or stratified epithelium, more than 1 layer. We call them as stratified epithelium or stratified epithelial tissue. So I'll be using epithelium and epithelial tissue interchangeably. Epithelium simply means epithelial tissue. So we have established that just by looking at the number of layers, you can call it as unilaminar, single, or simple epithelium. Then if it has more than 1 layer of cells, we'll call it multilaminar or stratified epithelium. So we have exhausted already 1 system of classification. Let's look at another system of classification, which is based on the shape of cells. So we are going to system number 2. So when we are considering shape of cells, there are 3 types of shapes of cells. We have flat cells, cubic shaped cells, which we call cuboidal epithelium, tall cells, which we call columnar cells. So let's go straight into it now. So we are still on classification number 2, system number 2, which is classification based on the shape of cells. So let's begin with flat cells. So when we find flat cells, we call it epithelial, squamous epithelium. So here we're saying the width of these cells is greater than their height. You see that these cells are broad, but they are not tall. So we call these cells as flat cells. Even their nucleus here appears flatter. So such kind of epithelium is useful in areas where we need rapid diffusion of gases and water molecules, where we need the rapid transportation of gases and water molecules to and from the cells or between tissues. Okay. Where do we find this epithelium? Where there are flat cells and only with 1 layer, which we now call as simple squamous epithelium. Simple squamous epithelium is found in the alveoli of the lungs. It's also found in the outer wall of the Bowman's capsule, which we are referring to here as the renal corpuscles. It also found in the thin segment of loop of Henle or the renal tubule. The thin limb of loop of Henle. You know, loop of Henle has thick and thin loop. Now the thin loop has simple squamous epithelium. Okay, then the inner ear will also have simple squamous epithelium, and all blood vessels in the body, whether they are arteries, veins, capillaries, name them, all blood vessels, their inner lining is simple squamous epithelium, flat cells, and only with one layer. Okay. Next is cuboid epithelium. Cuboid epithelium is epithelium made up of cells which have equal width, equal depth, and equal height. So all the four sides of the cell are equal in terms of measurements. So these cells are fat cells, or they are broad cells. They are not flat. Where do we find these cells? So these cells are found in areas where we need extensive or rapid absorption. If you observe at these cells, you see that these cells are more like a cube. Then they have a nucleus that is round. And this nucleus is in the center of the cell. Center of the cell. So where in the body do we need extensive and rapid absorption of water molecules? It is in the distal and proximal convoluted tubules of the kidney, because that area will require water to be conserved in the body. So to prevent the body from losing excess water, when glomerular filtrate is formed, much of the water is reabsorbed back into circulation because of these cells. These cells have been specialized to perform that function. What about the toe cells? Where can we find toe cells? So toe cells, we call it columnar epithelium. And since it is one layer here, we are calling this as the simple columnar epithelium. Same with this one. One layer of cells, so we are calling this as simple cuboidal epithelium, and this is where it is found. This one is simple squamous epithelium, and these are the areas of the body where you can find it. Now, let's focus on simple columnar epithelium. So simple columnar epithelium, if you look at the cells appearing like columns. These are toe cells, call them columnar cells. If you observe the nucleus here are located closer to the bottom or the basal pole, different from cuboidal epithelium, where the cells are round but located in the middle of the cell. So where do we find such epithelium? So such epithelium covers body parts or organs that, or it is found in body organs that are specialized for secretion. For example, the gallbladder. The gallbladder will store bile, which is produced by the liver, and only secrete bile when it is needed, especially when we ingest food that is rich in lipids or fat. Stomach produces what we call gastric juice. In that gastric juice, there is amylase, there is pepsinogen, there's hydrochloric acid. The cells producing all that are columnar in shape. The uterine cavity is lined by similar cells. The fallopian tubes are lined by similar cells, which we are seeing here. The nuclei are almost at the base. Nuclei almost at the base. Same with this one. Nucleus at the base. So this is simple columnar epithelium. Its function is secretion. Now, we said simple cuboidal, the function is absorption. Simple columnar, the function is secretion. We should keep in mind to say, apart from absorption, simple cuboidal epithelium can also secrete, but its major function is absorption. When it comes to simple columnar epithelium, its major function is secretion, but can also be involved in absorption. That is very important. Let's look at another type of epithelium. Again, looking at the shape of cells. So if you look at these cells, the shape of the cells is still columnar. The cells are tall cells. except that instead of having nucleus that are located at the bottom, these cells, the nucleus, are located in an order that is not well arranged. If it was simple columnar, if you see here neatly, the cells are at the bottom, but this one, the nuclei are at the bottom here, but this one, the nuclei are located at different levels. This one, the nucleus is up. This one, the nucleus is below, nucleus up, such. So we call such epithelium, even though it is columnar epithelium, we call it pseudostratified. If you observe here, you may think this epithelium has more layers than one. So that's why we call it pseudo. Pseudo means false. Stratified means more than one layer. So this is false stratification. But at the end of the day, these cells are tall cells, so we still call it columnar. So the accurate name is pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. Where do we find such epithelial tissue? It is found in the tubes of the respiratory tract, that is the trachea, the bronchus, the bronchioles, the alveolar ducts, and also in a small organ found attached to the testis known as the epididymis. The epididymis is an organ where mature sperm cells are stored. So it's just a tube that is highly coiled, and the inner lining of that tube is pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. So we are done with unilaminar epithelium. So if you have followed well, we have combined two systems. We are looking at a layer of cells. Here it's just one layer, one layer, one layer. But we also added the shape of cells. One layer, but the cells are flat. We call it simple squamous epithelium. One layer, but the cells are cubic in shape. So we call it simple cuboid epithelium. One layer, but the cells are tall. So we call it simple columnar epithelium. One layer, but the position of the nucleus are not consistent. So we call it pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. And you know where to find all these four types that we have discussed. Away from that, let's now go to multi-layered or multilaminar or simply stratified epithelium. So here, we'll be expecting more than one layer of cells. Let's quickly go into it. So I want us to focus on this one here because it's more clear than what we have down there. So stratified epithelium, ignore the title here for now. I just want to explain this here. So stratified epithelium will have more than one layer. For example, this is one layer, second layer, third layer, fourth layer, fifth, and sixth layer. Now, how do you classify this? Because it's now confusing, because apart from having multiple layers, is it stratified? Is it columnar? Is it cuboidal? So when you're dealing with multi-layered epithelium or stratified epithelium, you should look at this shape of cells in the superficial layer. Like here, look at the cells in the bottom. The cells in the bottom are tall. The cells in the middle, they seem to be cuboidal, but the cells on the surface are flat. So this is what you should focus on to name this epithelium. So this is stratified squamous epithelium because the flat cells are the ones in the superficial layer, which we are seeing here. That's a nucleus. That's the nucleus. But here in the bottom, the cells are columnar. Cells here are cuboidal, but there they are flat. So where do we find stratified squamous epithelium? Stratified squamous epithelium, it is found in areas where there is mechanical stress, where there is friction, where there is pressure, you find that type of epithelium. For example, the skin. The skin is always being scratched by something. The clothes that we wear, when bathing, we are scrubbing our skin. Sitting, we are sitting on our skin. All that is mechanical stress, pressure, friction, and what have you. Now, of importance note is that stratified epithelium, stratified squamous epithelium are of two types. There's keratinized and non-keratinized. What do we mean by keratinized? Keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, apart from being found in areas where there is mechanical stress, they are also found in areas where there is potential drying. For example, the skin, we are always moving, and the sun is, we are exposing ourselves to the sun. So the sun is producing light which has heat, and that heat can evaporate water from the skin. So to prevent excessive water loss, a special type of protein fills up the cytoplasm of these cells in the superficial layer. So these cells will be filled with keratin inside there. The nucleus is lost, and therefore the whole cell becomes filled with keratin. Hence, we call it keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Examples of where it can be found is the skin. So the skin is stratified squamous epithelium. And that's why on the skin, we find other keratinized tissues. For example, the nails. The nails is keratin. Hair is keratin. Okay. What about non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium? It is also found in areas subject to mechanical stress or friction. But these areas are already protected from drying. Okay, so for example, there will be skin covering them. For example, the glans penis, the glans clitoris. So the clitoris and the glans penis, the tip of the penis, they are already covered with skin. So they will not be losing water. So instead, they will have non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. The vagina, the esophagus, and the mouth. Okay, these are internal organs, so they are already protected from drying. So they don't need keratin, and therefore they have non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, meaning the cells in the superficial layer here, the flat cells, do not have keratin in the cytoplasm. And you see where to find them: mouth, esophagus, vagina, glans penis, and clitoris. Keratinized one is skin. Now, what about stratified cuboidal and stratified columnar? Stratified cuboidal and stratified columnar. Remember that these two types of epithelium share the function. Cuboidal main function is absorption, but can also secrete. Columnar main function is secretion, but can also absorb. So where do we find them? So we have this diagram, which is showing us stratified cuboidal epithelium. If you look at the nucleus here, the ones in blue, they are round and almost in the center of the cells. But you see that there are two rows here. There's one row in and another row out. So this is the inner row, this is the outer row. So this is two layers of cells. So we call this as stratified cuboidal epithelium. This type of epithelium is usually found in exocrine glands. All exocrine glands have ducts, and those ducts, they are more like a tube. So those ducts are lined by stratified cuboidal epithelium. So the larger the duct, expect stratified cuboidal epithelium. If the duct is small, expect stratified columnar epithelium. Where else can we find stratified columnar epithelium? Stratified columnar epithelium is found in the secretory part of the glands. So glands have two parts. The exocrine glands, to be specific, have two parts: the duct and the secretory part, where the product is made from. So the cells that are actively forming, for example, sweat, tears, saliva, pancreatic juice, the cells that are forming those substances I've mentioned are columnar cells. So they are found in the secretory part or unit of the gland. Then the duct will transport those products I've mentioned: sweat, tears, saliva, pancreatic enzymes. The duct will transport those products to where they are needed. And now we're saying the duct will be covered with stratified cuboidal epithelium. So in summary, stratified columnar epithelium forms the secretory part of the gland, whereas stratified cuboidal epithelium covers the duct part, or you can say excretory part of the glands. There's another special type of stratified epithelial tissue, which we call transitional epithelium. Transitional epithelium is a special type of epithelium whose cells in the superficial layer do not resemble those three types of cells we've mentioned. These cells are not flat cells. These cells are not cuboidal cells. These cells are not columnar cells. Rather, these cells, because of being broad on the top and narrow in the bottom area or the basal area, these cells are considered as umbrella-shaped cells. We call these cells as facet cells or umbrella cells. Umbrella cell or facet cells. Now, these cells, because they are broad apically and narrow basally here, these cells, you see that one cell will be covering smaller cells underneath it. You didn't see that in stratified squamous. Look at this stratified squamous. One flat cell equals to one cell below it. One flat cell, one cell below it. One flat cell, one cell below it. But when it comes to transitional epithelium, one umbrella cell will cover 3 to 4 cells underneath it. And these cells can be cuboidal, columnar, flat, and so on and so forth. So when you see these cells, then you know that you're looking at transitional epithelium, or otherwise known as urothelium. Uro means urinary system. Urology, study of branch of medicine to do with conditions affecting the urinary system in men. Therefore, we borrow that name from there, urothelium, or otherwise known as transitional epithelium. So this is a specialized type of epithelium found only in the urinary system. It covers the inner lining of the bladder and the urinary tract. Ureters and urethra. The first part of the urethra is covered in this. Okay. So this epithelium is also called transitional because when the bladder is full, the layers are few here. When the bladder is empty, the layers are many. So if you can count, this is one layer, second layer, third layer, fourth layer, fifth layer. So at this stage, the bladder is full. So when the bladder is empty. When the bladder is empty, the bladder shrinks in size. And the layers are 4 to 5 in an empty bladder. But when the bladder is full, the layers are 2 to 3. Okay, they seem to drop in number, 2 to 3. Okay, now, what happens is when the bladder is filling with urine, so urine will be collecting here, and then the bladder keeps on stretching. What happens is these cells, since they are more like an umbrella, they will stretch and allow these 2 or 3 layers, this layer, that one, and this one, to collapse in the spaces underneath these cells. And therefore, the numbers will reduce from being 5 to being 3 or 2. And that's why you call it transitional epithelium, or rather urothelium, found only in the urinary system. Nowhere else in the body are you going to find this type of epithelial tissue. So we are done with classification of epithelium based on number of layers and also based on the shape of cells. Now, let's look at the third system. Classification of epithelial tissue based on apical or surface specialization. Apical or surface specialization. Now, when it comes to specialization, our focus is on cilia and microvilli. So ignore what we are seeing here. The rest is just for us to summarize the work. But when it comes to apical specialization, we are looking at cilia and microvilli. So we said epithelial cells have apical surface or apical pore and basal pore at the bottom. So we're saying surface specialization. We're looking at what is on the surface. So columnar epithelium, we said its main function is secretion, and the cells are tall, like we are seeing here, and the nucleus are located at the base. So there are certain types of columnar epithelium which have surface specializations. And that's surface specialization. Number one is cilia. So cilia is defined as hair-like projections found on the surface of cells. So this is cilia. Then we have microvilli, the same columnar cells and cuboidal cells. They can have surface specialization known as microvilli. Now, microvilli is defined as finger-like projections. If you are seeing here, you see that these are more thick than cilia. So, what is the function of cilia and microvilli? So, microvilli is also known as brush border or striated border. We'll start with cilia. Cilia, the function of cilia is movement. So cilia, you see the cell is not moving, but cilia is moving. So the cells remain fixed or static, but cilia moves in one direction. So cilia is found in pseudostratified columnar epithelium and also columnar epithelium. Remember, pseudostratified columnar epithelium was found in the respiratory system and epididymis. Those cells also have cilia, and cilia helps to move mucus in the respiratory system and also helps to move sperm cells in the epididymis. So that is a function of cilia. So there's mucus here in the respiratory system, and the mucus traps microorganisms, dust, and what have you. Then cilia will move this mucus towards the pharynx so that we can cough it out and spit it up or simply swallow it. Much of the mucus in the respiratory system is swallowed. When you cough it, usually we swallow it because in the stomach there is acid, and that will help to destroy any trapped microorganisms. That's about cilia. So apart from being found in the respiratory system like the trachea and in the epididymis, ciliated cells are also found in the fallopian tubes. Remember, fallopian tubes was lined by simple columnar epithelium. Those cells also have cilia. Same with the uterine cavity. They help to move the sperm cells towards the fallopian tube where fertilization takes place. What about microvilli? Microvilli can be found on two cells, that is, columnar cells and cuboidal cells. Remember, we talked about the proximal and the distal convoluted tubules. In the proximal convoluted tubule, the cells there are cuboidal. Apart from that, those cells also have microvilli, finger-like projections. Now, different from cilia, which is for movement, microvilli is for increasing surface area for absorption. So we find microvilli, a lot actually of them, in the proximal convoluted tubule. In the distal, the microvilli is there, but they are few. Okay. Now, in the intestine, there's a part of the intestine which we call the ileum and the jejunum. These two parts of the small intestine and also in the large intestines, This is the area where there's extensive absorption of water. Ileum, jejunum, ileum, and large intestine, or colon, if you like. The cells there are columnar cells, simple columnar epithelium, but those cells also have microvilli. So in the kidneys, the cells are cuboidal, but they have microvilli. In the small and large intestine, the cells are columnar, but they also have microvilli to increase surface area for absorption. Then what remains here now is a summary of what we have discussed. This block shows us unilaminar epithelium, or what you call simple or single epithelium. This block here shows us multilaminar epithelium, or what we call stratified epithelium. So I expect you to study these shapes here and read through these notes for easier understanding. Otherwise, these are the books that we are using for reference. Meshner L. Janquira, or simply Janquira's Basic Histology, 13th edition going up. So 13, 14, 15 is fine. There's also another book that is useful for basic tissues known as Witter's Functional Histology. 60th edition going up will be fine. So the next topic we'll discuss will be glandular epithelia. For now, we end it here.